CNN Headline News. I'm Tori Atali sitting in for David Goodnow. Mikhail Gorbachev is once again ruling the Soviet Union. He's expected to address the parliament of the Russian Republic in less than 3 hours. He arrived in Moscow early Thursday from the Crimea, where hard-lined communists had detained him for 3 days. The hard-line coup came unraveled Wednesday, and Mr. Gorbachev immediately assumed control. After arriving in Moscow, he spared no words when describing his feelings toward the coup planners. He called them a small, miserable group that wanted to bring down the Soviet people. He says his vacation home in the Crimea was completely surrounded by the Soviet troops during the entire incident. And he thanked everyone who helped bring him back to power.
What did they do to the president and his family when for 72 hours they surrounded him with troops and wanted to break his willpower, but they lost? And here is my respect to Soviet people, and specifically to Boris Yeltsin, the President of Russia, to all labor collectives, to all people who stood up in the way of reaction. This is what we should be proud of.
Moscow was fairly quiet early Thursday, but some citizens couldn't bring themselves to go home. Instead, they played music and celebrated the coup's failure. Wednesday afternoon, the streets were much more crowded. Tens of thousands of pro-democracy protesters gathered outside the Russian parliament building, cheering as Soviet tanks obeyed Gorbachev's order to withdraw to their barracks. The tanks of defecting soldiers that became blockades are now in the process of being removed from around the Russian Republic's parliament building. Federal tanks were ordered back to their quarters on Wednesday by an armed forces official. The Red Army failed to defeat the barricades of Boris Yeltsin's supporters. Similar barricades were formed outside parliament buildings of other republics as well. The Soviet Interfax news agency reports 5 members of the 8-man State of Emergency Committee are under arrest. Among them, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, KGB Chief Vladimir Khrushchev, and defense official Oleg Baklanov. Russian Republic officials say they were arrested at the house where Mr. Gorbachev was kept. Boris Pugo reportedly has been arrested in Moscow. The Russian Prime Minister describes the other 3 committee members as doomed. He claims all will stand trial within days. The post-game analysis of the 3-day coup is already underway. Many people, including Bush, feel the coup's organizers failed in their planning and underestimated the will of the Soviet people. Rick Salinger analyzes what went wrong.
It was unimaginable. The Russian people defeating the military establishment, beating back tanks with bare hands. Analysts cite several reasons for the coup's failure. At the top of the list, the will of the people, the heroics of Boris Yeltsin, the ineptitude and misjudgment of the coup leaders.
In practical terms, they failed to do something very elementary. They failed to cut off Yeltsin's communications and Western media communications straight away. And in this way, the opposition to the coup could mount.
He says the 8-man committee of hardliners weren't united. And when it came down to a military assault on the Russian parliament building, they didn't have the stomach for massive bloodletting. Their troubles were compounded when troops and tanks defected to Yeltsin's side. Oleg Gordievsky was a colonel in the KGB before he defected in 1985. He says the coup leaders totally misread the age in which they were living.
They did have the experience of a coup against Nikita Khrushchev in 1964. And at that time it was easy because the country basically still was the same old-fashioned totalitarian communist country. So having replaced Nikita Khrushchev, everything was very easy. Now, as a result of the glasnost, perestroika and democratization, democratic forces were there in the new Russia.
Resistance to the coup spread from the streets of Moscow to Leningrad and beyond. Despite efforts to control the media, the people knew they were not alone. Former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher says Western support for Yeltsin and Gorbachev and condemnation of the coup were critical factors.
And I think that must have had a very bad effect on the morale of those who wanted to have a coup. A very bad effect. I think they were taken by surprise about everything. By surprise about what happened within the Soviet Union, by surprise about the strength and perseverance of feeling outside.
The Soviet hardliners and their once feared military and KGB cohorts were defeated and humiliated in 3 days by the will of the Soviet people. In the end, analysts point out it was an old-fashioned coup in a new day and age. The Soviet Union has changed and will probably never be the same. Rick Salinger, CNN, London.
As the coup began to collapse, shooting was reported near the parliament building in the Lithuanian Republic's capital, Vilnius. The parliament's press office says a Lithuanian guard was killed and 3 people were injured when Soviet Interior Ministry troops tried to force their way past a checkpoint. It's unclear what sparked the incident. Wednesday, troops were reported to be withdrawing from the Baltic states. An anonymous supporter of Gorbachev left a gift outside the Soviet mission to the United Nations in New York. A bouquet of flowers was found at the mission's gate after the coup attempt failed. Soviet diplomats are thanking all Americans for their support during the crisis. U.S. analysts say the aftermath of the coup attempt will force some changes in superpower relations concerning everything from economics to independence. And Deborah Potter reports Russian President Boris Yeltsin will be getting a lot more consideration.
Yeltsin's emergence from the crisis in a position of strength will force the Bush administration to rethink its relationship with the Russian leader. Just 2 years ago, he couldn't even get in the front door at the White House.
Oh, power talks. And Yeltsin now is the dominant power in the Soviet Union.
Now, despite the personal loyalty President Bush feels to Mr. Gorbachev, one U.S. official said we will have to disengage. In his words, Gorbachev has had his day. But the U.S. has no intention of undercutting Mr. Gorbachev. Economic assistance to the Soviet central government, including credits for the purchase of grain, will resume as soon as possible.
We will certainly, if things work out in a satisfactory fashion, get back into the business of furthering the economic recovery, certainly.
The coup, however, did nothing to resolve the country's severe economic problems.
It would not help the Soviet Union at all if we were simply to say, here, we'll just shovel massive foreign aid to you because you've survived this coup.
But some analysts say the reformers deserve an immediate economic boost.
This is clearly an episode in the history of the world which we can't turn our backs on. And the question of investment, of devoting money, is in our mutual interest.
There is also renewed talk about what happens next in the Baltic states. New calls for Washington to formally recognize the Baltics.
They have earned the right. They have demonstrated where their people stand, and I think the United States ought to take a lead on that.
Officials here say that's unlikely unless the Soviets act first. But they do see an expanded relationship between the U.S. and the republics. It was happening already, said one official, but the coup will accelerate it. Deborah Potter, CNN, the State Department.
Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev speaks out on his return to Moscow, while those who tried to oust him face criminal proceedings. CNN Headline News. I'm Tori Atali, sitting in for David Goodenow. After 3 days under house arrest, Mikhail Gorbachev is free and speaking out against the 8-member emergency committee who launched the failed coup. Gorbachev flew into Moscow from his vacation home in the Crimea in the middle of the night local time. At the airport, he made his first public comments since being detained on Monday. In an interview on Soviet television, he described the coup's failure as a victory for perestroika. He had special words of thanks for the Soviet people and Russian Federation President Boris Yeltsin, but only harsh words for the coup plotters, who he called a small, miserable group.
The president was entirely isolated from its own people, its own country, from the rest of the world. So they wanted to morally break the will of the president and his family. But they lost. It just didn't happen. And I'm sure why.